How could you do this to me? You cheater!
Anyway, we need to find out what the people on the streets think about this.
It's the wrong thing to do, I guess.
It's fine. I think it's okay.
A lot of people do it because they think they're cool. But obviously it's a bad thing because they're completely betraying a partner's trust. So, yeah.
I think while I personally don't agree with adultery, I don't think that it's okay for the legislature to intervene in the personal lives of people and say that, hey, this is what the entire country wants, or this is what the entire country says, because it's a personal choice at the end of the day. People in polygamous relationships are okay with cheating, okay with forgiving that. It cannot be governed by the law. It's purely a personal choice.
Okay, next and last question. What do you have to say about the state intervening in the sexual realm with adults who have agency?
I think there is no need for the state to intervene in the sexual realm. Again, I think this also has boundaries, because I think when it comes to, if you say sexual realm, it also comes to marital rape, it also comes to consent, it also comes to just in general non-consensual acts of sex. There, the state should intervene, but anything that's completely consensual in the sexual realm shouldn't be intervened by the state.
Thank you very much.
She really broke my heart. I hope she gets jail time.
Hello everyone, thank you for tuning into Kal Parso Tak TV. I am your host Vansh Tharoor, and I will take you through an overcomplicated explanation of the history of adultery. Adultery is that element of history that a traditional modus operandi of historiography does not deal with effectively. Our normative tendencies of fitting things into a narrative falls victim to the human tendency of a subjective value attribution that denigrates the result of an objective history. This is especially pertinent in discussing an act as adultery that transgresses the bubble of the domestic and attacks archetypical understandings of a family unit and society, muddling the waters of the historicization of adultery and the laws that should govern it. The taboo that surrounds adultery has been omnipresent in society. In fact, the very act has caused gargantuan ramifications that have changed the course of history. Just look at Henry VIII and how his philandering caused the Church of England to break away from the Vatican. Considering the massive effects that adultery has caused in the world's history, the ever-paternalistic state sought to control it. The quintessential example of the state interference in sexuality to demarcate approved relations of sexuality, that is marital rights, and the unapproved ones that can be seen in the provisions of the Indian Penal Code. Even though initial drafts of it opted not to criminalize adultery under the influence of actors such as Thomas Macaulay, who stated that it should be seen as a private wrong and not a social one, the final and enacted version of the IPC in 1860 considered adultery to be a crime, an act so heinous and abhorrent in society that the state inserts itself into the narrative of the individual to punish him. In so doing, Macaulay and his fellow drafters rigidized the parochial determination of adultery on the basis of archaic conceptions surrounding the domestic sphere, and institutionalized the system of patriarchy that the undertones of an adulterous act represent.
I mean, I don't understand how this ended up as the outcome at all. Why is the state interfering in matters of the bedroom at all? Not every issue can be boxed into neat, labeled little boxes. I mean, consider philosopher Devlin's arguments in the Justifications of Adultery Law. He posits that a society's moral fabric stems from collective ideals, and the erosion of these values marks the initial step towards societal disintegration. He argues that the reasonable person's view on morality should guide the legal framework, all while acknowledging that not all morally reprehensible behavior should be criminalized, thus advocating for keeping adultery outside the realm of criminal law. But where do we draw the line on what behavior is simply reprehensible and what behavior warrants criminalization, according to the public? Devlin believed that women don't engage in adultery unless they want the second relationship to be permanent. It's ironic that women's autonomy as sexual beings was boxed into their status as dependents. His opinions could be considered morally redundant by contemporary standards. The existing legal fiction that a married couple is a single entity in law also facilitates action only against the third party, robbing the parties of their individual agency as sexual beings. If Usha Ramanathan's view is to be taken, the reasonable man does not accord women as more than chattel. Female adultery has, in fact, also been much more harshly persecuted than that of men. Within the realm of fiction, authors often depict a wife's adultery because the consequences for female adultery have historically gone much deeper than the ramifications for an unfaithful husband. The discrepancies involving the treatment of adulterous women stem from three sources: the unequal penalties dictated for adulterous women by religious bodies like the church, a man's political and physical power over the body of a woman, and the economic dependence of a woman on a man. Consider three quintessential adultery novels: The Scarlet Letter, Madame Bovary, and Anna Karenina. They all involve instances of female adultery in countries around the world. If not by way of legal consequence, many women, like Hester in The Scarlet Letter, were societally condemned for their adulterous ways, uncharacteristic of the ideal of the chaste and virtuous woman. Cultural and moral values like this create double standards for the persecution of adultery, whether societal or legal in nature, on the basis of moral ideals. Hence, I think it is important to examine the potential of moral ideals as prospectively redundant if we are to consider whose moral ideals we are dealing with in the first place.
Adultery was decriminalized in India by the case of Joseph Shine versus Union of India in 2018. The Supreme Court based their judgment mainly on sections 14, 15, and 21, stating that the law was inherently sexist, biased against women, and therefore was unconstitutional. However, there were little to no arguments otherwise brought up in the court. They failed to acknowledge where the line should be drawn between morality and the right to privacy and other such rights of agency. Why did the state take up the responsibility to constantly maintain the sanctity and sacramental nature of marriage? Prominent philosopher Patrick Devlin uses the argument of the state, using the morality of the reasonable man over a rational man, suggesting that societies protect their moral values even if not everyone agrees with them. Honestly, I believe that the state has no right whatsoever in involving itself in the realm of sexual agency. So, though certain limits can be drawn, consensual relations between adults are within the private realm and should not invoke any sort of criminal liability or prosecution. This is irrespective of what the norms of morality actually are in that society. Ratna Kapoor actually brings a very interesting argument into this topic. The criminalization of such acts like sodomy and adultery versus non-criminalization of certain acts such as marital rape, which are very grievous. And this is centered around the idea that certain acts of sexual expression are culturally acceptable and used to contain a woman's sexuality. I think that we should work towards formulating a legal system and legal approach that respects the diverse sexual expressions and refrains from unnecessary intrusion into private affairs.
The Indian law on adultery is an unapologetic articulation of patriarchy. A man who enters into a sexual relationship with a married woman without the consent or knowledge or connivance of her husband is guilty of adultery and can be punished with a jail term of up to 5 years. If a married man has an affair with an unmarried woman, no adultery subsists. Adultery is, in Indian law, a violation of another man's marital home by another, in which women are seen as passive objects wholly devoid of agency. Section 497 specifically says that the woman in an adulterous relationship will not be considered an abettor. This does women no favor. Modern India cannot afford to have such gender bias in its laws. Removing such bias would mean two things. Adultery must be understood as violation of the commitment to sexual exclusivity that marriage entails, not as a violation of a man's marital home. Further, women should qualify as culpable agents, not passive objects of male will in the offense of adultery. Marriage should sustain on the strength of mutual trust, respect, and love, not out of fear of a jail term. Modernizing the law on adultery is essential to live up to the commitment to equality offered by the Constitution. Feminists like Veena Das argue that the roots of adultery can be traced back to Hindu theology, which prescribes rituals for women who commit adultery. This reflects a patriarchal system that emphasizes a woman's accessibility to her husband and her purity. Flavia Agnes emphasizes that women are not considered aggrieved parties in adultery cases, as the focus of morality is driven by patriarchy is to challenge the legitimacy of women's claims. The current provision is rooted in sexual morality, and it's evident in the fact that only men can initiate prosecutions against other men who have engaged in intercourse with their wives. No other claims are recognized. In summary, feminism opposes Section 497 of the Indian Penal Code because it upholds traditional patriarchal concepts of marriage and treats women as property of men, allowing only men to initiate legal action in cases of adultery. Feminists argue that since preserving marriage and controlling human sexuality are not legitimate state interests, the only appropriate remedy for adultery should be divorce.
The Vedic understanding of a chaste woman is one where she is completely and faithfully devoted to her husband. She is sexually pure and serves and worships her husband, who is the sole center of her life. This woman is barely an individual with her own rights and agency. She is an extension of her husband and an object to do with what he wills. This very concept is challenged by the notion of adultery, where after cheating, a woman would now be ostracized and executed in society as a homewrecker and a whore. Death is a better alternative to this life. Similar is the story of Chandra's death, where a woman's illicit affair with a married man gets her pregnant. She dies in a hush-hush attempted abortion. This end is more acceptable than any other alternative. Another example which highlights the endless cycle of abuse these women are trapped under is the plight of Devdasis, who were given to temples and worshipped as the wives of gods. However, this worship soon turned into exploitation and abuse, wherein the priests of these temples would rape and ravish these women. The Devdasis were eventually forced into a permanent life of prostitution, and in some texts were even blamed for adultery. This brutal social stigma and the character and chastity of women being called into question can be seen not only in adultery but also through sex work and prostitution. Sex work is something that could be said to induce adultery. Women of unchaste nature tempt men away from their marital vows. However, these dirty women themselves are exploited. Colonial laws on sex work are highly problematic. One example is the British Colonial Policy and the Contagious Diseases Act of 1864. This law, during the rule of the East India Company and after the Great War of Independence of 1857, was rigorously enforced in India. The true intention of this act was not to prevent vice and immorality among British soldiers, but rather to degrade and stigmatize prostitutes as filthy and impure beings. These native women were sexually explored and pushed into prostitution, where they were victims of venereal diseases which further spread among them, degrading them even more. However, their white clients managed to maintain their integrity and respectability. Poor women became trapped in this life of sin as the colonial government denied them the opportunities to earn their own independence. These women were now blamed by men and other women for furthering and causing adultery. One must, however, understand that these sex workers were bred into this cycle of abuse and exploitation with no way out, and then were later blamed for the very thing they were forced into.
On June 17, 1886, a military order known as the infamous Circular Memorandum 21A was sent to all the cantonments of India. The order authorized the exploitation of Indian women by the British regiments. The regimental commanding officers were instructed to take girls from the villages, selecting the best looking ones, and deliver them to the House of Vice. It is estimated that around 800 to 900 soldiers would have sought the services of the regimental prostitutes daily. This led to the spread of STDs among the soldiers. The diseased prostitutes were removed from the cantonment and fresh girls were brought in. The soldiers would remove the diseased state of the prostitutes to the military physician surgeon, who would then inspect them. The British were hypocrites who portrayed the Orient as a place where prostitution was accepted, while condemning it in their own society. Prostitution, which focused on pleasure rather than procreation, highlighted the divide between the Christian and the heathen. Despite the judgment on Indian women's innate desire for sex and the condemnation of child marriages in India, rampant prostitution existed in England, especially among the upper aristocracy. The British soldiers found it degrading to undergo medical checkup for diseases, while women branded as prostitutes were legally required to do so, often at the hands of male physicians. The British administration differentiated prostitutes based on caste and religion, categorizing them into various groups. These included high-caste Brahmin prostitutes, who were maintained by rich patrons, prostitutes of good caste who lived independently but had fewer resources, Hindu prostitutes without means who rented accommodation and catered to Hindu customers, regardless of caste and religion. There were also public prostitutes of Muslim creed, low-caste Hindu prostitutes, and Christian and European prostitutes.